Okay, so what we're looking at here is Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, and there's a lot of stuff in this lecture that's kind of like fun stuff that I'm not really going to talk about, and something we'll kind of talk about in class. So I'll kind of hit the stuff you need to know, and then we'll kind of enjoy the culture part of the 80s tomorrow. First off, Ronald Reagan's promise to cut the federal budget is not really going to happen when it comes to our military spending. That's going to occur during the 1980s. Um, Ronald Reagan is going to be building up our military, our conventional military, and of course the reason being for this is because the Soviets are building their military up. We want to have bigger and badder weapons. We want to have more people ready to fight, and the Soviets are doing the same thing. And you have these massive military exercises going on in Europe where NATO troops were doing drills, pretty much preparing for this really big kind of invasion, land invasion by Soviet troops into Western Europe, which of course never happened, but that was kind of the thought process at least. The problem with this is that the threat during the 1980s is going to begin to change. And though the Soviets were still considered a major threat, what was even more scary was the emergence of non-state organizations, aka terrorist organizations. And there's going to be a major escalation of terrorist attacks in the Middle East and in Europe, even in the United States in the 1970s and 80s. A lot of terrorism will be done on behalf of the Palestinians as kind of a way to garner attention for the Israeli treatment and occupation in Palestine. Also, what you're going to see are terrorist attacks in Lebanon. There will be actually a deployment of U.S. troops to Beirut by Ronald Reagan, and during their time there, they will actually there will be an attack at a U.S. embassy in Beirut and also a U.S. Marine Corps barracks, and I believe that attack kills almost 200 Marines at the barracks, and I think they were car bombs. Um, and of course, what this meant was that no matter how big of a military you had, defeating terrorism, that didn't really make a dent. It didn't matter how big your military was when you were fighting an organization that didn't have a state, that didn't have borders, that didn't have a standing army. And so this threat that emerges in the 70s, and then we see it very much come to the forefront of policy in the 1980s, is going to be something that U.S. presidents are going to continue to grapple with to this day, and how to effectively combat it. This is one of Reagan's kind of kooky ideas here, and this one really hurts the Soviets in terms of getting them to spend money. So the program was known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, but everyone affectionately referred to it as Star Wars. And what this program involved was the use of satellites and lasers to pretty much protect the United States from attacks by Soviet nuclear missiles. So basically, these satellites and lasers would blow up nuclear weapons before they reached the country. Now, the program was unbelievably expensive, and so it actually never happens. Partly because it was expensive, and also because um, we were worried that by doing this, it might jeopardize the strategic arms limitation talks. And so the program kind of gets scrapped. However, word leaks to the Soviets about the program, and of course their thought process is, well, then we got to build something bigger and better to be able to penetrate this Star Wars defense system, and also, maybe start to look at our own. And it does kind of get the Soviets to spend again, to start, unloading cash on something like this. So in a way, it was almost like it was kind of, Star Wars was almost like a bluff, and the Soviets kind of took it. In 1983, under Reagan, the U.S. is going to invade Grenada. There will be a case where you had Cuban soldiers and troops there who were kind of trying to install a communist government. There were American medical students who were there that U.S. troops were deployed in to kind of protect. Under Reagan, just like with Carter, the CIA is going to funnel aid to Afghani rebels, the Mujahideen, who were fighting against the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan to protect the communist government that was there. Reagan will also have the CIA and the Department of Defense arming rebel groups in places like Angola, in Africa, to fight against the communist government there. Also, Reagan does side with South Africa's government, which at the time had a policy of apartheid, and so that obviously didn't look very good. In Nicaragua, there is a major issue that's going to become probably the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration. And there was a group who were kind of, they weren't full-fledged communists, but they definitely had communist leanings, and they were known as the Sandinistas. And Reagan begins helping a group known as the Contras. And these were basically rebels who were fighting against the Sandinista government under the Somoza, who was the dictator at the time. And what we're going to see here is this issue is going to evolve into what becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, at the time, the Iranians and the Iraqis were engaged in a war against each other. And Congress had stepped in and told Reagan to not provide aid to the Contras. Basically, don't intervene in the civil war. It's really not our business to be there. Reagan's administration secretly provided the Contras with weapons and training, trying to keep them up and running to fight against the Sandinistas. And of course, the war was incredibly destructive. It obliterates the Nicaraguan economy. And it is going to undermine the support for the Sandinista government, which is what the Reagan administration wants. But he's having to do this secretly. Now, because Congress says we can't support them, that means that we can't provide money to the Contras. And so, at least on the books. And so what will happen is the U.S. is going to sell arms to Iran. And this is kind of twofold. One, we would sell weapons to the Iranians to use in the war against Iraq. And the idea here was we could use this to help get the Iranians to pressure Muslim terrorists to release 7 American hostages that were being held currently in Lebanon. Now, what we were doing, though, is we were taking the money that we were getting from Iran, and since it was kind of off the books, this money was then going to buy arms to sell to send to the Contras in Nicaragua. And the affair itself will come to light in '86. And there will be some very serious accusations against the Reagan administration that we were trying to negotiate with terrorists to release these 7 American hostages, that Reagan had blatantly disobeyed Congress on providing aid to the Contras. And Oliver North, who was one of the members of Reagan's Security Council at the time, will take most of the heat for it. And when they're done with the report, kind of the prosecution, they find out that Reagan technically had not broken any laws, but that Reagan and Vice President George H.W. Bush knew about the diversion of funds to the Contras. And if they didn't at least participate in it, they kind of turned a blind eye to it. And this, of course, becomes kind of the big scandal of the Reagan administration that will really hurt his credibility. Okay, one of the things that leads to the fall of the Soviet Union will be Mikhail Gorbachev, who took over as premier in the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev does 2 programs that will begin to kind of lessen the totalitarian regime of the Soviets. First is called Glasnost. And what this did is it basically relaxed censorship on media and freedom of information, meaning that the Soviet Union, which was infamous for manipulating the news, they didn't have freedom of press, that sort of thing. This allowed for that, which meant that the government, all of the corruption within it had to be exposed, and that the media could expose it, and they wouldn't be sent to a gulag or something in Siberia. And the second program is called Perestroika, and this was an economic program. And basically, this tried to end the command economy of the Soviet Union and replace it with a market style economy. Both of these programs, of course, will chip away at the power of the Soviet Union and will also kind of push it towards becoming less communist, less oppressive. The other big part that played a role in the fall of the Soviet Union was actually Pope John Paul II. And one of the things that he does is he supports a movement known as Solidarity. And this was a Polish movement where a group of dock workers in shipyards formed this anti-Soviet movement, and they worked within the Catholic Church. And the goal was to basically try to get Soviet influence out of Poland. The Pope comes, he meets with the leader of the organization, and it was a nonviolent movement that actually brought semi-free elections into Poland in 1989, and played, like I said, a very big role in kind of pushing the Soviet Union out of some of these satellite states that they were controlling. In August of 1989, citizens from Hungary began crossing the border into Austria. And of course, so they're leaving technically Eastern Europe and entering Western Europe. But the difference was that there were no consequences. People were not stopping them. The police weren't stopping them and checking their IDs. I mean, these people just literally start walking across the border. This pretty much sets off a tidal wave of refugees who begin leaving the Eastern European countries and entering into the West. And the guards just stand there. They just let them come apart. Some people begin dismantling barbed wire fences and checkpoints. And on November 9th, the media begins to announce that the borders were opened. But this didn't happen. The Soviets didn't say, okay, borders are open. And so the guards along the border, they didn't know what to do. But when these massive crowds started pressing along the border, the guards thought, well, I guess just let them pass. And that's what they did. And so on November 9th, 1989, you saw the unification of Germany. And this was basically the symbolic image of the fall of the Soviet Union, of people chipping away at the Berlin Wall and breaking through and coming back across. In terms of technology, the 80s becomes known as the computer age. We start to see some of the first personal computers, the Mac. You'll also see the development of cell phones, which of course were fairly large. Arcades, Nintendo. Technology was a very big part of the 80s. The Japanese made a killing off of making all sorts of devices like the Walkman cassette players, and selling these things in the United States. And Americans were very crazy about like technology in the 80s. You also saw the beginning of cable network stations like CNN, the Weather Channel, and so people would tune in and watch these cable network programs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.